Thank you so much, Magda. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the session today. My name is Chanel van der Merwe. Today's talk is entitled Statelessness and Contemporary Enslavement by Dr. Jane Anna Gordon. So I now have the privilege of introducing Dr. Gordon to you. Jane Anna Gordon is Professor of Political Science with affiliations in American Studies, El Instituto, Global Affairs, Philosophy, and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. She's a specialist in political theory with a focus on modern and contemporary political theory, Africana political thought, theories of enslavement, political theories of education, and methodologies in the social sciences. Gordon is most recently author of Statelessness and Contemporary Enslavement 2020 and Creolizing Political Theory, Reading Rousseau through Frantz Fanon 2014. She's also co-editor with Drusilla Cornell, who was with us last week, of the forthcoming Creolizing Rosa Luxemburg, as well as co-editor with Cyrus E. Zeda of the Politics of Richard Wright, Perspectives on Resistance 2019. Beyond these, Dr. Gordon has numerous other publications. We are indeed very lucky to have her here with us today. Thank you, Dr. Gordon. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for the introduction. And I want to begin by thanking the organizers and hosts of this workshop and speaker series for creating such a vital and important space for intellectual conversation. And I also want to thank all of you who are here. I know that many are from Penn State and others are from many other institutions, but if where you are is anywhere like where I am, this has been a remarkably challenging semester, and it seems to become more rather than less challenging as the weeks go on. So I appreciate your being here. So I'm going to focus primarily on challenges to the idea that there can be something called coherently contemporary enslavement, and why I think, if illuminating in important ways, those challenges are ultimately wrong. But I want to speak very briefly about the larger argument or work of the book of Statelessness and Contemporary Enslavement. And I'm happy in the discussion to focus on whichever elements interest you most, whether or not those are about the question of enslavement. But so as the title makes clear, the book focuses on both statelessness and on contemporary enslavement. One of the central arguments is that when both of these themes enter public discussion, they're talked about as radical exceptions and also as radical political failures. It's usually suggested that at least now they're both considered moral evils or unacceptable, and that we have the existing legal and criminal mechanisms to deal with them. In the book, I argue that both statelessness and contemporary enslavement are not exceptional at all, that with statelessness, it was created with the Euro-modern state system itself. So to understand what I mean, it's important to consider that statelessness takes more than one form. It takes many forms. So prior to the emergence of Euro-modern nation states, most territories were occupied by semi-sovereign nations with their own languages, ways of governing themselves, sometimes flags, and with their own historical alliances and antagonisms with one another. But the earliest process of creating stateless people was when Euro-modern nation states developed themselves by engulfing and enveloping these many once semi-sovereign nations into their own growing orbit. So in many cases, the members of these nations were offered membership and citizenship, but as individuals, not as members of the nations through which they understood themselves. For some, the outcome was an upgrade. Their quality of life was improved. For many others, the state that resulted remained and remains an occupying an illegitimate one. So they saw themselves as nations without states. This process is repeated with crucial differences in imperial moments, where there's a desire for territory and sometimes for labor, but not for meaningful incorporation of the nations that are being colonized. Still, even in many of these cases, especially in North America, once the project of settler colonialism was seen as having been achieved or completed, citizenship was imposed on indigenous individuals through forcible incorporation. So that's sort of one mode of statelessness. A second mode of statelessness is more familiar, and it's the one associated with World War II or with Syrian or Afghani refugees today. This involves when people are literally forced or made to leave the place to which they belong with nowhere else to go, since the world is carved up into states and they are what offer political membership. Another facet of this kind of statelessness was that the quote unquote solution in many of these instances was to create territories that functioned in extra legal ways. So these were territories in which regular law did not apply. So examples that are typically given are concentration camps, but there are many other examples of Japanese internment or prisons or deportation facilities or slave plantations. These were and are territories within nations, but where everyone forced to be there is subject to a different set of rules or laws or regulations. And then there's a third mode of statelessness in which people are citizens of states, but what that membership offers them or what it can enable is eroded or diminished so much that political institutions don't seem to actually generate any meaningful counterweight to economic or other forms of inequalities. They may in fact be the source of those inequalities and those forms of xenophobia. And yet at the same time in this mode, the states that offer that membership are treated as, that's all that you can expect. You can't expect more. So part of what I argue in the book is that while tireless efforts of activists and international lawyers have made statelessness an issue receiving very necessary political attention, that the greatest challenge is that while there are forms of statelessness that really are due to bureaucratic failures, so these are failures to anticipate a particular kind of situation, such as surrogate birth in another country or islands that are facing being swallowed up by rising water levels. But in most cases, it's actually states that render their would-be citizens stateless. And this is so much so that even with considerable international pressure to eradicate mechanisms of robbing people of citizenship, they often translate into the people who are then instated, facing the same systematic challenges that their citizenship and legal standing was supposed to offer. Was supposed to address. So I then turn to enslavement and talk about how long and broad its history is. And so I break the discussion up into three primary moments, into the pre-transatlantic, the transatlantic, and then the present. Unlike the transatlantic, before it, what I argue is that the major determinant of a slave's actual life conditions were whether or not the polity in which they were enslaved was an empire or had imperial ambitions. But even then, because the source of enslaved people was actual war, there was an understanding that there was a contingency in who ended up as an enslaved person, that had the outcome of the war been different, the roles could have easily been reversed. So in this period, slavery was multinational, it was multiracial, it was not colorblind, and it was not color oblivious, but there was not a sense that particular colors of people were rightfully master or enslaved or any fixed category in between. And in that discussion, I also talk about important differences in Muslim enslavement, the very different way that Muslims historically practice enslavement versus Christians and especially Christian capitalists. So initially, when I began doing this project, I thought it would be a book on contemporary enslavement. I hadn't planned to conjoin that with what became the statelessness portion of the text. And I really came into the discussion of statelessness, ironically, by invitation. So there was a series of 3 conferences that Ramon Gross-Figuel, Eric Mielens, and Louis Gordon organized in Paris over 3 years. One was focused on global anti-Semitism, another on statelessness, and a third on global anti-Blackness. And for the statelessness one, Ramon contacted me and he knew that I had just finished my PhD in political science and political theory. So he asked me if I could attend the meeting and offer a theoretical overview of the issue of statelessness. Everybody else who was participating in a way that's much more characteristic of study and activism of statelessness was focused on a particular instance of it, rather than an overarching framework that brought each of the instances together. So I thought this was a daunting task, but also a really important one. And so through my political theory coursework, I knew, as everybody who goes to that coursework does, about Hannah Arendt's classic discussion and about international law that emerged out of World War II. And these were useful to an extent, but they didn't say much or anything to all of the other instances of people who'd been made stateless in their own homes. And these were people who'd been made stateless through processes of colonization. And so I began to try to figure out how to put Arendt in the international law discussions into conversation with all of these other instances, which were actually far more global in their reach and far more numerically relevant. And so while I was doing that, I stumbled upon this book, which was incredibly helpful. It's by James B. Minahan, and it's a book called The Encyclopedia of Stateless Nations. And it's a thick book. I mean, it really is an encyclopedia. And it lists nations of people who consider themselves to be stateless. And everywhere in the world was represented. And I thought this was what I needed to begin to reconcile with accounts that treated as this exceptional failure. Right. Another formulation that really helped was Vine Deloria's Custer Died for Your Sins, where he argues that what Europeans do in the Americas began internal to Europe itself. And so he reminded readers that the formation of European nation states also rendered all kinds of nations of semi-sovereign people stateless through forcible incorporation. And so I began to think about how statelessness as a mode has many different faces. One is the familiar pushing people out, but another is forcible inclusion. But with each, they involve a kind of severing of the relationship between territory and belonging that's sought by those people. And so that's how I really entered into the conversation of statelessness. And I'd been thinking about slavery in very different terms. When I first learned that there was contemporary slavery, I was surprised. And then I was embarrassed that I had been surprised because it should have been very clear to me that there was such a thing. And so I had assumed in response that what I was going to do was a very straightforward text about how contemporary slavery is built out of the grammar and the continued legacies of racialized slavery, rather than being, as some were suggesting, something that was post-racial. But what surprised me was that the people I've always considered my primary intellectual and political allies, and who still are, hated the designation contemporary slavery. Many rejected it out of hand. Others insisted it was a misnomer and a really, really politically dangerous one. And so rather than a study of contemporary slavery, tracing its connection to older forms and seeing what was new and different, I found myself wrangling with their objections. I thought they were really important. I also thought they were wrong. And so I began to think about how an institution will be similar and different depending on the circumstances, and that of course enslavement will look different in different political economic conditions of, say, the 21st century rather than the 16th or 17th or 18th. A lot of objections, and I'm going to talk about them a little bit more in a second, but a lot of objections to studies of contemporary slavery were really objections to the ways that white activists in England and Western Europe had mobilized discussions of it. In many of those discussions, they seemed to turn political attention away from ongoing legacies of racialized enslavement rather than pointing out that this newer form was a continuation of them. And so as I worked through those debates, I began to realize was that if statelessness was about failures to connect land and political membership, discussions of slavery are clearly about failures to connect labor to political membership. And so I realized these were two faces of the same coin. But it's not just that they're two faces of Euromodern failures, they're also more concretely connected. So if you're a stateless person, you're vulnerable to all kinds of exploitation and unfreedom, including enslavement. And then on the other side, if you've been an object of racialized enslavement, it's highly likely that even once formal abolition has been achieved, that you may well live in a continued condition of de facto statelessness. And so, for instance, I began through the research for this book to think that many conditions facing Black people in the Americas really are ones of a kind of statelessness. And so that was a framework of understanding that I hadn't grasped prior to putting the two sort of pieces or the two phenomena together. And so the book really culminates with a small set of questions and some preliminary answers. And so the questions are, if you put these questions, statelessness and enslavement, which face the vast majority of humankind front and center, what are the political obligations that follow? What is it that institutions can do to foster connections that have been severed among territory, labor, and belonging? And what does meaningful consent look like? And so part of what I do in response is to offer a qualified defense of the value of the concept of consent. And what I essentially say is that while there have been highly cynical and empty ways of thinking of consent, loads of them, it really is indispensable to the project of self-governance. And it helps to name and illuminate much of what's wrong with many forms of exploitation. But aspirations to self-governance need to inform how we think about it. And so we usually use consent to talk about choosing among bad choices, right? Rather than constituting what generates the field of options. And so to be meaningful, consent really needs to be about the latter, about generating the field of options. And so an example of this is something like public budgeting, where you're not just dealing with the crumbs. But also there needs to be a lot of attention to what it means to meaningfully opt out of something. So to say a meaningful yes, you also need to be able to really actually say no. And so David Hume, who I otherwise don't like very much, offered a really useful challenge to social contract theory, where he said that saying you can leave a polity if you don't like its terms is like saying you can jump off a ship, in the depths of the ocean. And so what does it mean to say no if it's not just jumping off a ship? Right. And so in the book, I give two examples. One is of centers of day laborers that discuss, one is of centers for day laborers that discuss particular employers who withhold wages or do not provide protective gear to keep workers from being injured by doing a day's work. And so at those centers, they share information about these people and then practice both how you make particular demands on a job, but also how you refuse employment if the employer doesn't do what they should. And they envision that work of learning to say no as actually practicing citizenship. And the other example comes from the Women Collective in South Africa, who use the language of consent to speak about anti-extractivist activism. And so they frame consent not as something that's given or withheld in a particular fixed moment, but as part of a longer and broader process, in this case of rejecting the idea that extractivism is essential to national development and that Indigenous communities can't refuse it. So for them, consent describes the process of response and, crucially, for them, saying no. In this case and others, it's not seen as just an act of negation, because saying no is actually saying yes to a different way of envisioning development in a South African future. And so then I close with offering a response to what I actually consider very legitimate anti-statism. And the argument is straightforward. We need political institutions and can and must have better ones. And currently states do a lot of severing and alienating of people, enabling predation rather than curbing it. But there can be institutions that foster well-being, and figuring out how to create them should be our number one priority. And so just briefly turning to the discussion of slavery, I just want to kind of offer a quick overview of some of this, right? So as many of you are probably very familiar, right? Many historians of slavery are very averse to even the possibility or the desirability of a trans-historical definition of the peculiar institution. So they'll argue that the form and meaning of enslavement has been so varied that to try to have any encompassing definition would obscure more than it would reveal. And many folks who make that argument center the historical enslavement in Africa, and will say first and foremost that the slave relationship wasn't about ownership, property, and the purchase of people, but instead, in many instances, in terms of kinship and lineage, right? And so in these instances, the argument's made that the opposite of slavery wasn't freedom or autonomy, but advancement within an elaborate social hierarchy that assumed interdependence and dependence as well. At the same time, there are many people who argue that historical differences between slave systems didn't create any difficulty for cross-cultural trading in slaves. So if there were differences and very meaningful ones, they were also mediatable, right? And so when it comes to thinking about what it was that might have been being mediated, so what it seems to sort of stand up to the fact of very meaningful differences, there's sort of two consistent dimensions that emerge, right? The first is that the slave is bought and sold or moved according to decisions that are not their own, right? And this can be done cruelly, it can be done sadistically, it can be done humanistically, but who it is that's making the decision about their movement is not them, right? The second is that it seems in every instance I've ever seen, there's some dimension of foreignness that's either obvious or created through the relationship of enslavement. So in most instances, the slave is literally an outsider in the sense of coming from elsewhere. But there are many ways of making somebody come from elsewhere, right? So internal to ethnic groups, people can also create foreignness. But crucial to that, because in many cases, the ultimate definition of a foreigner is somebody who is without kin, who appear with them. And so one of the most essential dimensions of the enslaved relationship is that the person is individuated from the whole kinship web of which they're part, because they're attached to the master and that master society rather than their own. And any kin suggests the world of which they come and its obligations rather than the new ones that have become primary. And so from there, I turn really to the discussion of Kevin Bales, who's sort of famous and infamous in this domain of life. And he draws a set of comparisons to try to single out what it is that's distinctive about contemporary enslavement. And I'll say from the outset that these arguments have been criticized and mischaracterized and widely adhered to in terms of thinking about these issues. But when he tries to explain sort of what it is that's new about this moment, he does it through a series of very rough contrasts between contemporary enslavement and the transatlantic moment. And both are sort of rather stylized in the process. But at the beginning, he sort of says that in the past, enslaved people were expensive. And so the purchase of an enslaved person was a major investment. By contrast, today, there's a glut or an oversupply of potentially enslaved people. And this is tied very directly to the exponential growth of the world population, right? But the result is that purchasing a person today is not considered a major economic investment. If in the past ownership over a slave was always asserted, Slavery was not only legal and protected by law, there was an entire edifice of its rationalization. But now claims to legal ownership tend to be avoided because of its illegality, but also because the claims aren't worthwhile. They don't translate into anything useful for the person who would be doing the claiming. It's easiest to buy and sell people where law enforcement and state institutions are dysfunctional, and where law is understood primarily in terms of policing and punishing rather than seeking to alleviate conditions of the vulnerable. While racial, ethnic, and gender inequalities do play a role in who's most likely to be enslaved, there's much greater variation in the demographic nature of the master-slave relations than was true in this transatlantic slave trade. Even so, there's a huge overrepresentation of people from rural communities and among people who are disabled and among people who are subordinated and minoritized and often already stateless. The relationships between masters and slaves in the past tended to be long-term, crossing generations. Now, with the exception of debt bondage, which spans generations, if not immediately useful, a slave is simply discarded, right? And so these relationships are typically very short-term. Unlike in the transatlantic model where enslaved labor was concentrated in specific domains of the economy, in the contemporary world economy, slaves produce a smaller proportion of a huge range of commodities. So if slaves are understood as human commodities, contemporary enslaved people resemble contemporary commodities as well, right? Within that, there are three sort of main groupings into which contemporary enslaved people are typically divided. There's chattel slavery, which is all too familiar. There's debt bondage, where people pledge themselves against a loan, but the loan is very ill-defined, and so it doesn't matter how long people work, their indebtedness never seems to go away. And then there's contract slavery, which is really the contemporary version of indenture, but where we don't seem to have the laws to actually enforce when it is that one's debts have been paid. So Bales has stated clearly and without qualification that there's a difference between enslaved people and exploited workers. And for him, the major difference is a very crude one, that enslaved people literally can't leave their situation without threats of force, whereas the force that wage slaves face are economic, that you need to work to live. Right. Bales also thinks this is the first time in human history where slavery might be eradicated once and for all. And he links that to activism at the center of which are enslaved people themselves. But there are many reasons why people reject this designation and conceptualization entirely. And I'm going to quickly say what those objections are and then sort of my initial thoughts about them and then stop talking. So the arguments against slavery being a proper designation take four primary forms. The first is that slavery could only exist where it's legalized. The second is what I've termed racial ethnic exceptionalism, where only a certain group of people who underwent racialized slavery ever really were slaves or enslaved. The third is a technical idealism that suggests that to call anyone an enslaved person is to say that they manifest a complete absence of agency and personhood, which is not tenable. And the fourth is an anti-statist critique that envisions contemporary brands of abolitionism as necessarily rationalizing the further empowerment of predatory states. So in terms of the legal argument, it goes like this. For some, there's no slavery where slavery is not legal. The argument is that legality suggests societal approval or permission that's absent where the institution and practice are outlawed. If it's not legal, it's part of the illicit economy and the domain of criminal justice. In these circumstances, if a slave escapes, the world is not on the side of the master. When illegal, ownership cannot be openly asserted. If some people are able to extract profits from others through individualized or well-organized thuggery, it might be argued this still cannot be considered a full-fledged economic relationship. Necessarily clandestine, it's surely abusive and exploitative, but slavery, when legal, makes the use of force and coercion something other than violence. There's several responses to this argument. First, the outlawing of an activity changes the conditions in which it's pursued, but need not eliminate the activity itself. For much of the history of the US, abortion was illegal, didn't stop women from deliberately terminating pregnancies. The crossing of borders without proper certification is illegal, and such movement obviously continues. For those who support the outlawing of abortion, it's murder, and anything else is euphemistic and misleading. When legal, the crossing of borders is permitted tourism or immigration. In short, there's no doubt that legality and illegality color the activity undertaken and determine the potential stakes, but the substance of what's involved continues. We could add that while the legal status of the slave could resolve certain forms of conceptual and political contestation, there's never been uniformity in law within the US or between the US and the rest of the globe. And where there were shared laws, this was by no means, it by no means ensured shared practices. So put differently, the sheer variety of lawmaking has always made the letter of the law an inconsistent and elusive source of clarity. Also, people disagree about whether certain laws are right or inadequate or even legitimate. So if law is supposed to stand in as a gauge of what's acceptable, it's not very useful when one considers the relationship of law to labor practices. For those seeking to extract the greatest profit from workers, the precise employment arrangements can be deliberately altered so as not to be outside the law. Labor and many other laws are regularly flouted, again, raising questions about law as an index of public morality. So when it comes to the question of law, it seems like the more pertinent question is what happens when institutions, regulations, and norms are not there to make arrangements that are supposed to be temporary. In the racial exceptionless mode, slavery can only mean racialized enslavement, and specifically the racialization of African enslaved people who are then framed as natural slaves in ways secured through political, social, and legal support. To call anything else slavery is to trade in metaphors that detract all too scarce attention from the ongoing legacies of literal African enslavement for people of African descent in the West today. Slavery was tied up with the very formation of nation states who avowed racist reasoning under countries' flags, developing international legal frameworks that made it legitimate business in which European populations were involved en masse. Such a momentous historical formation casts very long shadows. There's no question that there's a greater willingness to focus on suffering of and to condemn crimes afflicting people who are not African. There's also no doubt that the likes of Kevin Bales and others appear as re-enlivened versions of older models of great white hopes, offering highly personalized politics of redemption in which they portray, in the form of invitation to others, their own rude awakenings and subsequent transformation into transnational human rights actors. In addition, the earliest movements that have made the spate of forced labor visible in the US were those that linked combating trafficking to the active pursuit of a neoconservative agenda at home and abroad. All of these things could be read as contributing to the marginalization of hard-fought struggles to grapple with the ways that the legacies of the transatlantic slave trade continue to shape the lives of people on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. But to insist that only the transatlantic trade of the trade of the Americas was slavery is also dangerous. If you look at it in complete isolation, you can't understand what's distinctive about it and how it combined elements of practices that were much older with things that were then genuinely new. It also makes it impossible to see how the present continues much of that past with newer ingredients added in. In this way, I see this position as being much like those within the European and European descended Jewish community for whom nothing outside of the suffering of their own kin in World War II might be called a Holocaust. This isn't only a historically untenable position, it makes it impossible to see how Nazis borrowed from models developed in the Americas for indigenous peoples and African peoples, and how people today borrow and refashion elements for their own purposes. It also leads to historical mischaracterization. With the transatlantic trade, it began with kidnapping and banditry that would continue, but the legalization and social and political approval of the selling of particular people followed the emergences of such practices. So the law became an ex post facto effort on the part of national governments to harness potentially significant profits and to assure that whatever transpired on such a significant scale remained within the orbit of their official powers, seemingly within their control. Part of contemporary enslavement being global means that local, national, and regional forms of discrimination combine in idiosyncratic and really new ways. Someone from a denigrated ethnic rural group may not be recognized as that beyond national or regional borders where those differences are salient. So for instance, being Eastern European is not the same in France as it is in the United States, where distinctions between East and West are less significant than those of North and South. Similarly, while being a member of a particular Thai ethnic group will be hugely significant within Southeast Asia, one is simply Thai or even just Asian in the United States. For others, particularly Black people, they seem to bear marks of misfortune the world over. For people falling falling into this category when freed, it would be more accurate to describe them as occupying a situation of neo rather than post-slavery, either because they are literally re-enslaved or because they occupy a society that treats their labor as without the rights to remuneration and that sees their expendability as something that can be turned into acceptable ways of generating profits, as in the case of the US prison system. Still, to judge the potential aftermath of the experience of slavery, whether there can be a post-slave rather than a neo-slave experience, as a criterion for whether enslavement took place, is to confuse matters, putting the cart before the horse. At the same time, it would be an error to deny the experience or existence of situations of enslavement because those so implicated may not face the after effects. There are clear patterns of who's vulnerable to enslavement, and these have everything to do with histories of colonization and enslavement. Most people trafficked in the US are Indigenous and Black. Many are immediately caught the minute that they leave foster care at age 18. Similarly, we know who has to find their way around rather than through borders and who can work for but must struggle to belong to a society. These are people whose exploitation has been normalized to a point of invisibility. And third, for many feminist social science scientists, the rise of talk and policy making around trafficking unravels hard-won feminist gains. So for them, the terminology makes it impossible to see the reality of what's transpiring, that there's an unprecedented number of women who are migrating globally. Many of these women know that in order to do this for a time, they will do some variety of sex work. They often also know that such work can be dangerous. Some are tricked or fooled or make mistakes like many other male migrants who travel to unfamiliar places before them. But instead of this, in trafficking language, women only appear as victims and only receive protection if they enact their victimhood. So once women are described as incapable of undertaking adult action, they require rescue by those who know best. So for somebody like Kamala Kempadu, the language of slavery only makes this worse. So the idea is that to call somebody a slave is to say that they have no agency, right? It's not true that enslaved people have no agency. The ideal and aim of enslavement is to do precisely that, to strip a person of any and all forms of agency, but that doesn't mean that that was ever actually achieved. There's also no doubt that women can choose to do sex work. Many discussions of sex work make the real error of not only understanding sex work, but of valorizing and romanticizing non-sex work as intrinsically better. At the same time, while not denying that women act with agency, even under the most constrained of conditions, for sex work to be freely chosen, there do have to be other options. In other words, we should ask, what is it about neoliberal political economic developments that have so enlarged the number of women entering what's been called the oldest of the professions? The final set of criticisms is closely tied to the final one, which is undertaken in an anti-status mode. So many claim that those most willing to push for mandates of protections of the trafficked in international and domestic lawmaking are precisely those with the strongest ideas about the ways in which the quote unquote victims are in need of reform and rehabilitation. So for these scholars, for these reasons, scholars trace the activism on behalf of the trafficked to the earlier rise of new bourgeois educated women who carved out employment for themselves through trying to save or care for less fortunate, especially sex working women. Many of the bourgeois women's efforts were disciplinary and controlling, and while well-intentioned, more beneficial to their own advancement than to those in whose name they labored. So policies advanced in terms of protecting the victims of trafficking, such critics argue, do more harm than good. When traffickers are framed as shadowy underworld figures exploiting the absence of adequate transnational law, the knee-jerk response is always to tightly close borders and to reduce visa provisions for migrants who are actually seeking them. In addition, panic almost always leads to spikes in calls for increased homogeneity and the policing of sexual behavior in the name of conservative family values. And so what those kinds of policies actually encourage is smuggling and make things more dangerous by pushing it further underground. So even policies advanced in a regulationist mode, which treat sex work as labor and seek to bring it into the political domain, tend to empower those who sex workers consider the most violent antagonists of their work, which is law enforcement and police. And so this is the primary reason why most sex workers prefer decriminalization, since this would reduce the presence of the state in their lives. But to be able to talk about what kinds of policies are preferable, we're assuming the involvement of governments and of states. So what body is it that would decriminalize sex work? Which one would push for changed visa rules? So it is true that we should turn our focus from supposedly vulnerable subjects in need of passive confirmation of rights to social movements of migrant organizations and placing them at their center. But freedom in a political sense is not a natural condition only interrupted by political institutions. What we need are fresh political mechanisms informed by diagnoses of those most directly implicated and the organizational work that they're already doing. So just to wrap up, if you're a scholar based in Black studies, you're accustomed to devoting most of your time to problems that most scholars would probably rather ignore. And similarly, if your work is based in women's studies, you're used to people discounting the questions that you raise. My own interests in instances of contemporary enslavement are driven entirely by understanding how they can and should be seen as the continuation of unfinished theoretical and political projects that have been undertaken by these domains of inquiry. So I was very surprised to learn that many of my colleagues were so antipathetic to even calling contemporary forced labor slavery, even though that's the language that many people who are implicated use to describe their situation. And so while I'm sympathetic with many of these criticisms, the mobilization that's dominated the public arena in these areas has been fundamentally flawed, exacerbating the issues we're trying to address. But I see that as a problem of how the issue has been mobilized. We can and should focus on people actively resisting and developing more and more effective strategies for doing so. And that means we need to push for different immigration and labor policies rather than just punitive and predatory responses. But we're looking for the wrong forms of evidence if we insist that slavery can only be slavery if it's legal and avowed and looks only like the transatlantic model. A central obstacle more generally to political reflection is mistaking one particular historical instantiation of each for the phenomena themselves. So even if the European Jew has been the quintessential exemplar of the stateless person, while the kidnapped Senegambian is the prototypical enslaved person, for either to be quintessential or prototypical means that they should illuminate political predicaments well beyond and more general than their own. It's a failure to learn from their models if we expect statelessness and slavery only to take familiar forms from the past. That would require past global conditions to remain the same, when what makes both phenomena harder and more necessary to recognize is their adaptation to new global conditions. And I'll stop there, thanks.
Okay, thanks a lot, Professor Gordon, for this very rich account. And I'll yield the floor now to Sinfree to pose a couple of questions.
Okay, yes. Thanks a lot, Jane, for this intriguing presentation. I have a couple of questions that I want you to help me think through. So fundamentally, your argument, if I may caricature it a bit, is that the transatlantic model was only one type of enslavement. It is not the only type of enslavement. Is that the argument, that the transatlantic slave trade was only one instantiation of enslavement?
Yes, but with one crucial caveat,
Okay.
which is that it also completely transforms the racial order of the globe, so that whatever follows from the grammar that it introduced and its ongoing policies. But yes, with that caveat.
Yes. Okay. So then the question that arises is that, so the debate is, to what extent can you look at other forms of slavery in a manner in which your thinking is not dominated by the transatlantic model of slavery? In other words, to what extent can you be sensitive to other forms of enslavement which manifest themselves differently from the transatlantic model?
Yes.
That is the argument.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, right. So if that is the case, then why your argument is interesting and extremely fruitfully destabilizing is that you are saying that there might be local instantiations of slavery that may vary across different geopolitical spaces. Right? So my specific question is, in what way does Islamic slavery, for example, contemporary Islamic slavery, differ from contemporary Christian enslavement? Is there anything like, if there is contemporary Islamic enslavement, I don't see why conceptually there isn't enslavement, contemporary Christian enslavement. Because my thinking then is all religions have the capacity to enslave other people, right? That theoretically all religions seem to, I think, would enslave other people. So I'm interested in the comparison which may emerge between the enslavement in the Christian world with the enslavement in the Islamic world, and how issues about race play themselves out in these two religiously inspired enslavement.
Sure. So one of the ways that I would answer is to say that Islamic and Christian slavery were much more different. Were much more different from one another prior to the rise of capitalism.
Okay.
Right. So prior to the rise of capitalism, there were certain very distinct features of Muslim slavery that were really important for its lasting consequences, right? So one of the major differences was that the status of the child of the enslaved actually followed the status of the father rather than the mother.
Okay.
And so there are many, many instances of children of enslaved women experiencing considerable social and economic mobility.
Okay.
Right? And so the sense that you would have whole groups of people radically segregated in completely different sectors of life, there was much more mobility and much more movement and more permeability. So there are many stories in Muslim history of enslaved children who later went on to become, say, military leaders because their fathers were free. And that also had real consequences for racial differences, that the societies that emerged out of Muslim slavery were much more multiracial in terms of the statuses of people who moved. They were much less Manichaean worlds in racial terms. And that's not to say that there wasn't anti-Blackness. There certainly was, but the sort of the very Manichaean world of the transatlantic slave trade is not what you saw in Islam. The other bigger or distinct challenge in Islam was that one wasn't supposed to enslave a Muslim, right?
Okay.
And the idea was if somebody already was a follower of Islam, they couldn't be enslaved. Christians did not follow that rule. Or at least European Christians did not follow that rule. But it introduced a very important loophole, which was that often the ability to recognize whether or not somebody was Muslim was ethnically and racially inflected. And so, for instance, there were people who were enslaved who understood themselves to be Muslim, but they weren't seen as Muslim by their neighbors.
Okay.
Because their own form of Islam had become importantly localized in ways that weren't recognized by the people who were coming and plundering their communities. But the fact that there was that rule did create different sets of parameters and different ways for people to protest against their condition than had they been absent. But one of the things that's sort of remarkable about the present is that, and there are other important differences about Islamic slavery that are fascinating if you work on the history of enslavement. For instance, the gender ratio of the enslaved was reversed compared to the time. So there were many more enslaved women than there were enslaved men. And it was much more focused in urban settings than in rural ones. So much of the work that was done by enslaved people in the Muslim world were things like being porters, they were a whole range of
professions that they belonged to.
Yeah, and so there was rural slavery, and that was often actually the site of the most significant uprisings, because that's where you have lots of people doing concentrated work together, like producing cloves, say. But it's interesting how the gender ratio followed the primary location of enslaved people in urban versus rural domains. But anyway, but in terms of the contemporary period, you don't see radical differences in a meaningful way between Islam and Christian slavery in the capitalist world. In fact, if anything, that radical separation of people who are utterly lacking in rights is as clear in the contemporary world as it is was historically in the Christian one.
When you were presenting, what kept coming to my mind was the research some of the people who are on this forum do on domestic workers in different households. So I was sort of asking myself, to what extent do these domestic workers have rights? To what extent is this issue about describing them as domestic workers simply a way of disguising contemporary forms of enslavement? Is it productive to look at, let's say, some of the Africans who work in these domestic settings as contemporary instantiations of enslavement?
So two answers. At one level, the answer is definitely yes,
Yes.
and in ways that can only be understood, at least in the US context, through the history of the transatlantic slave trade. So the beginnings of labor laws in the US emerged during the Depression, right? The first of many economic depressions. But the condition for passing those laws was that two domains of labor be excluded from potential unionization. The first was domestic work, and the second was agricultural work. And the reasons those two domains were excluded was they were the work in which African descended people were primarily concentrated. So it was a deliberate effort to assure that recently freed Black workers in the US would not be able to unionize with workers. And so in many ways, the continued vulnerability of domestic workers has everything to do with those legacies. And so right now, I'm much more familiar with this in the US context, but there are active efforts to unionize people who
domestic
work and people who run domestic daycare centers out of their lives. But the very need for that unionization to be going on now is a distinct legacy of transatlantic slave trade. And many people who call themselves enslaved people are in precisely domestic work arrangements, because there are very few labor regulations that touch and can protect them. And so there's some situations that are not enslavement, I don't think. But there's some that those definitely are. And the ambiguity of that as a laboring situation has everything to do, I mean, with the history of enslavement, but also with the history of gender, right? The form of work that goes on in homes is traditionally not seen as work. It's invisible, it's work on which people rely. But one of the ways of devaluing it is to say that it's not labor. And so what makes it vulnerable to such radical exploitation nationally and transnationally is the history of refusing to see it as labor. And so that's absolutely the case. But the second thing I was thinking about in relationship to your question is, in the book, I compare the situation of literal slaves to guest workers. And not to say that guest workers are literal slaves, there are differences, but in terms of what's important about enslavement, there are many very important likenesses, right? And so the first point is a historical one, that when slavery was outlawed, the people who benefited most from it economically, the people who had owned slaves, turned immediately to guest workers as the next best solution, right? So for them, there was an obvious likeness in terms of what it enabled them to do. But the second point is a more political one, which is that one of the primary things that slavery does is the enslaved person doesn't have a relationship with the government or with law. Their relationship is entirely mediated by the person who owns them, right? But what's interesting with guest worker programs is they're the same, that they're regulations that are national that enable the entry. Once you are a guest worker, your status is entirely determined by the person for whom you're employed. So they're the one who reports whether you're in violation or not in violation of laws, whether you should be deported, et cetera. And so your status is mediated in a very similar kind of way, in the sense that you don't have distinct political standing. And so one of the things that I was trying to do in the book is not to say slavery is the most terrible thing and nothing else is bad. That's not useful. The whole point is that it clarifies how you undercut the political standing of workers. And so in many ways, what it helps us to do is to understand how that's achieved so that we can try to address it. But once you do that, there are these most important likenesses, especially with guest workers. Because the whole point with guest workers is they typically volunteer to come. So in that sense, it's very different. They're not being kidnapped to come to the place of work. But at the same time, they can never come with kin. They come typically between the age of 20 and 45. After 45, they're seen as disposable. There's zero pathway to citizenship. I mean, that's the condition of their entry. And they do work that's absolutely indispensable to feeding the people in the countries where they're working. But the work is seen as not part of the actual formal economy that's visible and seen. And so it's incredibly, it's unprotected. And so I think just as with domestic work and with guest work, you see these pockets where the literal history of the transatlantic creates a grammar for ongoing contemporary forms of vulnerability. And I think what's useful in trying to determine what enslavement is you can identify the sites of and the sources of vulnerability and precarity.
Okay, this is my last question. Then this is more of a comment. I then give over to Basi. In one of the African languages that I'm supposed to know, what is interesting is that the term for a prisoner of war and the term for household employee, etc., they all overlap. So as you were going through your presentation, I kept trying to work out whether what really has happened here within certain ethnic groups in Southern Africa is that the enslavement has been made linguistically acceptable by framing it more like, oh, these are just servants, right? The extreme form being, these are prisoners of war. But the word for prisoner of war in Shona, for example, and the word for servant, they're more or less the same, right? So I don't have any historical evidence for this. My suspicion is in the history of the Shona empires, there must have been cases of the Shona enslaving other Shona peoples. But I need to think this through. But linguistically, that's the only way I can make sense of making words about prisoners of war and servants overlap, right? That there must have been periods in which this was the case. Yeah. Okay, Basi, let me give you to Basi. Hi, Lynn, how are you?
Can I just say quickly in response, though, that it's a really useful point, because there was a period of war making where the defeated were not taken captive and brought back home, right? I mean, it was a moment very, very long ago. But once the practice was not simply to kill all of the vanquished, bring some back with one, what you describe is exactly what happened, right? Usually the men were not brought back in, but the women and children were. And non-imperial societies, which were the vast majority, they were simply incorporated into existing arrangements and households. And so whatever it was that women and children would do in those societies, these folks would now do as well. So the transition was a very smooth and direct one, and it's not surprising that it's reflected linguistically. But I think the key point about it is that what you see as the consistent dimension is those folks had their own kins and their own society, and they're attached, put in the service of another one. And for that to transpire, they're delinked from whatever it was that would have been. But the transition is, and it's global. That move.
Good, excellent.
And it's about displacing the lineages of the defeated men, right? Linked to the propagation and reproduction of the victors rather than
Good, excellent. Hi, Basi.
Yeah, okay. Thanks a lot, Sinfi. Thanks, Jade. I personally liked very much the connection between enslavement and statelessness. So as you were speaking, I was reminded of Diana Jeter's work in what was then Southern Rhodesia. Basically, some of the work she did, some of which Sinfree has just described. And I think one sees in a very interesting sort of way the connection between statelessness and enslavement being enacted in the vocabulary of the language, just like Sinfree alluded to. Now, in the Southern Rhodesian communities, Diana Jeter studies, prior to the arrival of the colonialists, the people referred to themselves as people of the place, people of the territory, people of the land, In other words, establishing a link, I think, between the territory, belonging, and labor, if you like. But then when the colonialists came, they turned a blind eye to the autonym, the name by which the people referred to themselves, and rather referred to them as Black people. Now, it may seem a very innocent sort of motivation, but it had the effect of severing the people from the land, from belonging. And in contrast, the Europeans referred to themselves in self-adulating ways. For instance, master, the overlord, which then created I think, the psychological basis for the subsequent enslavement and slavery and colonization that we had, such that the relationship of the locals was now defined in terms of who their masters were, rather in terms of the state structure. So I just processing your talk from that standpoint seemed quite revealing. It was very consistent with, I think, the argument Diana Jita is making as well. All right, so I think Lynn Mario has a comment, a question. Lynn?
Thank you, Basi.
Sure.
Yes, actually, my comment or question follows up from what you just said. I'm wondering if we talk about statelessness and enslavement, and when we spoke of the transatlantic slave history and process. I'm wondering if at the moment, and by the way, I'm speaking from Brazil, where we have, especially Sao Paulo, Brazil, where we have instances of enslavement, current enslavement within the city of, especially of Bolivian migrant workers. And we have instances of enslavement in rural areas of rural communities. Now, I'm wondering if putting these things together, enslavement and statelessness and territoriality, and also thinking from Brazil, one of the problems we have, which is the drug trafficking. I'm wondering if all of these don't point to the lie in nations and statehood. You mentioned that in certain areas we ask the questions which other people don't ask. So the question I'm asking here, which maybe I shouldn't be asking, is: can we still talk about states and nation states? Because these things, current enslavement shows us, as drug trafficking does, the inefficacy or the morbidity of the nation state.
I would say an emphatic yes, at the same time as we're stuck with them, at least in the immediate. And so there has to be, I think, a dual move of how within them to minimize harm, and how especially to identify the ways that they're making it lucrative to be predatory, right? I mean, I think states right now are incredibly good at facilitating exploitation rather than minimizing, curbing, or punishing exploitation rather than the exploited, sorry. But I think we do that best with a vision beyond them, right? And so I do think there's a place for nations, just not as the way to organize states. I think there's much to be said for national forms of belonging, some of which are rooted in historical relations to land of the kind that Basi was mentioning, right? So they're forms of meaningful belonging and organizing obligation and the meeting of needs that have historically gone on within groups that all got called nations in a certain period, whether or not they like that designation. But I don't think states are the place where that kind of belonging should be expressed. I think it should be informed by it, and it should probably borrow mechanisms that nations have been able to achieve. But it's clear to me that if what states are to do is to organize forms of meeting needs that we don't want to have fall upon individuals, that they should be delinked entirely from nations and need to be rethought in radically transnational ways. So I think, in terms of political thinking, that we need to be both smaller and larger than the nation state, but also to think about sort of what it is that's linked in different ways. I don't think the place of enunciation of nationhood should be states. I think states need to answer to and be informed by nations. But the idea that those could ever map onto one another has only had disastrous consequences for the vast majority of people. And so I think in many ways, we should, in terms of institution building, follow the work of social movements, which are doing precisely this, right? They often begin with the local, but realize how the local is linked globally. And our institutions are massively behind in terms of being able to do that. And so, as you were saying, all of the instances of transnational movement, it's people who are predatory, who know how to operate those circuits, not the institutions that are supposed to protect people. And so, for instance, drug trades do a very good job because there's no limit on how much violence can be used to facilitate movements and profitable movements. But it is precisely people who are needing to flee certain countries who land up in others and are the targets of easy trafficking, because what most states do is punish them for their vulnerability rather than address it. So for instance, when most people who are in situations of enslavement are caught, they're treated as illegal migrants, not as people who are being exploited. And so the issue should be about labor, about labor and migration. But the tendency of most trafficking work, unfortunately, is about shoring up nation-state boundaries, which are completely ill-equipped to deal with what it is that they're actually facing.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, so we have a question from Adrian in the chat. And it goes like this. What would you say of various forms of enslavement that are being constantly discerned within migrant Muslim households, particularly in cosmopolitan cities? And the reference here is to places like London, with families from Pakistan and Somalia. One might also refer to women from the global south being used for prostitution in Western capitalistic environments. What would be your thoughts regarding these forms of enslavement?
Sure. So the first thing to say is that there's a tendency, especially in the white Christian West, when we talk about enslavement, to think entirely about sex trafficking, right? As if it's the primary form that this takes. And it doesn't, right? It's in big Western cities where there's a lot of, where there is forced sex work, and there often isn't much attention to distinguishing between what's forced and what's not forced. But the vast majority of forced labor is not sex work. It's indispensable work like caring for children, growing food, cleaning hotel rooms, all the kinds of the maintenance of life. So forms of work that have historically been gendered and racialized are exactly those where people are most vulnerable now. And so you do see a ton of it in global cities, right? Sort of all the work that is the unseen work that maintains those places for global cosmopolitans. I often think that global cities are this strange combination of sort of global enslaved people and then cosmopolitans, and they circulate the globe in very different ways. But much of the work that furnishes the world for affluent bourgeois cosmopolitans is done by degrees of unfree labor. Some of it literal enslavement and some of it not. But the thing that's striking in response to the question is just the sheer variety of work that is done by enslaved people. It really is. We have an economy where work is so highly differentiated. And so what's interesting about enslavement is that it mirrors that. So for instance, with the transatlantic slave trade, I mean, so much of what drove the economy was the production of raw materials to be turned into industrial goods. And so you saw a very clear kind of concentration of where it was that enslaved labor was relied upon. We have a very different economy now, and it's reflected in all of the different ways that we see where it is that people are doing, our people are enslaved.
Okay, thanks. D. Mohale has his hands up.
Yes, I do.
Yes, please go ahead.
Maybe.
Thank you. So as I'm listening to the conversation on enslavement, I'm thinking about a situation of domestic enslavement, which I see so much in my country here in Lesotho. And I think many people from different parts of the world or Africa can even talk about something similar. So here's a scenario. Many times you have so-called expats, these being most of the time people from, the Western country or Asia. When they come to work in Lesotho here in Southern Africa, most of the time they come to work as consultants, and everything about them or everything for them is catered for. Their flight tickets, they get a very lovely house, they live in safe neighborhoods, they have their pets even catered for. Interestingly, when, let's say, someone from Lesotho goes to work in the mines of South Africa, they are not referred to as an expat. Rather, they are referred to as a migrant laborer.
Yep.
And when they get there, many of our men, like, they live in these overcrowded hostels, and only they can go there. They leave their families behind. And in so doing, this obviously disturbs the makeup of the family. So many lives have been affected by this kind of situation. When these men leave, nobody thinks about, whether they need to have their wives with them, And when they get there, obviously there are women that are available, and we know what happens when they get there. And this situation, I'm very much disturbed by the language that often is used to describe both groups of people. Why is one considered an expat and one considered a migrant laborer? Why is the other one's needs catered for and the other one's needs are not catered for? Like, when will these dynamics be recognized for what they are, and the alienating and devastating effect that they have had on families and are continuing to do so?
It's a fantastic question and comment, right? I was just yesterday teaching Marcus Garvey and then Fanon in class. And so as you're speaking, I'm thinking about how they might answer, right? That, expat assumes that you have somewhere to return to, so a place that is of global significance, and that when you travel, you bring with you the rights and power of that place, right? A migrant suggests that you have no such place from which you come, and it doesn't come with power and obligations. And you're exactly right. It's the situation is, it's exactly the same with guest workers, right? They can come on the condition that they come separated from their kin, right? Because if they bring kin, then the place to which they've moved will be transformed by their presence, not just by their labor. So it really is an effort to have their labor without their meaningful belonging, to absolutely sever their labor from the people who are doing the labor, right? The guest worker program, it's so profoundly xenophobic, right? It says, feed our nation, but stand outside of our laws. Don't change who we are as a people, and go back home when you're broken. And make sure your kids who would actually need public schools and your elderly relatives who may need healthcare, they have to get it back wherever it is that you've come from that we don't name, right? So the language really does capture a whole series of associations and profound discrepancies in treatment. But I think you're also right that that I mean the thing that disturbs me most, I mean, there are many things that are disturbing about enslavement and guest worker regimes, but one of them, it should really worry us politically, right? Because it's literally fracturing law. I mean, we already have law that is carried out in completely discrepant ways, right? So, I mean, in the US, it's not whether you committed a crime, but who it is that committed it and against whom that determines whether it's even treated as a crime, right? This is true of sexual violence. It's true of drug use. I mean, you name it. We in this country have such a legacy of plantation slavery that we do not have a unified legal system, right? I mean, there's some people are under penalized and other people are over penalized, and there's no actual law that treats people in a uniform way. But the same goes for what you're saying in terms of, you know, when expats go, it's like they go and there's a whole bubble that surrounds them where there are rules and laws that apply to them that don't apply to others. But the same is true for migrants, but in the reverse. Right, and you're absolutely right about. I mean, in the U.S., there's been this effort to sort of save work for white men facing unemployment by creating, you know, mining. I mean, the creation of natural gas. So there are these man camps around the production of natural gas, and some of the most intense trafficking of indigenous women is about supplying those men with women, right? And because they're literally alongside indigenous territories that often can't enforce laws against non-indigenous people, all kinds of mayhem transpires. And there's just sort of no law available to protect those women from what's transpiring. And the people involved know it and work those legal loopholes very, very deliberately. So thank you for the comment. You're exactly right, Dee.
Yeah, it's interesting how the vocabulary, the terminology used in this context is coming up frequently. One is reminded of right-wing parties in countries like Austria and so on, who basically said, look, Gastarbeiter, guest workers, the assumption is that you're a guest, you're done, go back home. So after 30, 40, 50 years, we've had enough of you, go back home. All right, so let's move on now. Kidane has his hands up and would like to pose a question directly to you. Kidane, the floor is yours, please.
Yeah, I think at the point, the relationship between statelessness and enslavement is really very strong. But could we extend it to the relations between very repressive states and enslavement? Because what happens is repressive states reduce their populations to subjects from citizens. And once they are subjects, then they are exposed to enslavement. So it is not only statelessness, but also being in a repressive state.
Absolutely. And it may be that the formulation that I use in this regard is one that people don't like, but I include as a form of statelessness when what it is that one has through membership in a state is so eroded that it doesn't counteract what it is that political membership is supposed to counteract, right? It might even entrench it further. So I do think there are people who have literal citizenship who are not de facto stateless people, but for all intensive purposes, they are stateless people because the only mechanism that could offer those things is completely antipathetic to doing it. So I completely agree. I mean, the authoritarian states are fundamentally anti-humanistic, they're anti-democratic. They rely upon really undercutting, if not eliminating, the political domain as a distinct domain. So I think the linkage you're making is exactly right. I would agree with it completely.
Okay. All right, thanks a lot. Stanley?
Thank you very much. I don't know if you can hear me.
I can.
We can.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for this beautiful event and the presentation and the discussion that has been going on. And for me, I don't know how to articulate all of this or take in all of it because it's directly what drives me crazy in the last few years. I'm one of the so-called migrants in Europe, and I've been trying to figure out, I mean, I've learned a lot historically also, and like what is going on currently. So when you're talking about like statelessness, historically the slavery, how they are connected, I'm quite intrigued to know that quite a lot of people know this historical facts, but at the same time, we are in a current situation where the same things are still repeating in the current migration topics. And of course, you talked about language when you're talking about slavery, turning people into slavery or into stateless commodities.
Mm.
And today, how that is also still happening. Mm. But for me, I find it very hard when we are using this, the language is still defined most of the times by the West, and most especially by academics themselves, who understand these facts, who know that the languages of being able to turn someone into stateless, being a stateless person, is one of the tools that the colonial oppression uses, but we're still doing it. I mean, we are still within the academics. I've tried very much working with in the field of academics or trying to get into it, even though it's a space I really hate, I don't like. I still try very much to use the same language, because if I don't use their language, I'm excluded in many ways. And in that way, it's not possible for me to break the bridge for them to understand how they are still reproducing my oppression in that sense. What's your, I don't know if I'm asking this as a question, but what's your opinion in it? Let's say we are still using the same languages, not being able to connect with the languages of the other or the institution of knowledge itself, doing the same thing. Can we change? Is this something as academics is this something that can be changed in order to include voices, knowledges of minorities, indigenous people, migrants in the current Western curriculum?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And if I can I ask you a question back just before I answer?
Yes, please.
So if you were to use language that seems more apt at grasping what it is that, say, a term like statelessness or enslavement is trying to name, what would be some of the words and phrases and concepts?
At first, I try to tell people or try to emphasize that I am not stateless, that I have agency. And these agencies that most individuals I am talking with, or I'm struggling to explain my situation, are actually the police of the state, trying to tell me, no, you cannot do it that way, but at the same time, they're allies, right? So I cannot really formulate at the moment what terms, but rather just to say that I am not stateless. I am a human being who should be defined not as a migrant, not as call me my name, like call me who I am, do not define me into these boxes of this state. But I cannot get that across, because at the end of the day, people still define me as a migrant, even though I do have a name behind that migrant.
Yeah.
I have a person behind that migrant, but even within this discussion, we are still doing it and not recognize the harm we are doing in the process.
Understood. Yeah. So just a couple of thoughts in response, right? So the first is, it's interesting. Palestinian activists who are fighting for statehood refuse the term statelessness, because their fear is that as soon as Palestinians refer to themselves as stateless, they've conceded the land to the Israeli state. And so it's interesting that they'll ally with other people who are doing work that's been branded work on statelessness, but they actually refuse that self-designation, and for strategic reasons, that it seems to concede a fight as lost that is still ongoing. right? And so just to sort of affirm what you're saying, that even if people are engaging with this language, many people place themselves in somewhere different from where others insist on placing them. But I think, it's interesting because, I mean, the word slave actually is a reference to Slavs, Eastern Europeans, who were typically enslaved by all kinds of people. And I love to tell my Black students that, because it's just interesting that in the US context, everybody associates Africa with enslavement, but there are very few human communities who've not been touched by some form of forced labor, and that the language we're using is actually describing European enslaved people. But I think the point is that the more constructive point is, my own view, and this goes back to Lynn's question from earlier, is that wherever it is that people work in a society, they should be able to participate in it politically. So it's not only with guest workers that it's a violation of rights and other things, but it's also a missed opportunity to create the kinds of societies that should exist. Right? If guest workers could actually talk about how it was that they could meet the needs of themselves and their families, we could actually develop the kinds of mechanisms that should be in place. And so the inability for those needs to be articulated is part of why we're sort of failing so miserably to have the institutions that we need. And so my feeling, Stanley, in relationship to the question is that at one level, you're right, that talking about statelessness and enslavement continues to center the terms of the people who are doing the exploiting rather than the people who are fighting it. And so the question is really sort of, what is it that the people who are implicated are looking for? And in many instances, guest workers, it's not that they say want to be American, but they do want to meet their needs, right? And the very fact that they're feeding this country should come with a whole series of obligations that it experiences. And so my own feeling is that what we need to begin to do in thinking about political institutions that are actually current as opposed to the outdated ones that we're relying on is to think about how labor should bring with it always a set of rights and powers for the sake of having contributed to the place already. But similarly, that when you go to certain geographical areas, the people who are its historical custodians should be treated as the hosts who you're visiting and who set the terms with which you interact. And so, for instance, there are many indigenous nations who say the issue isn't that Europeans came to the Americas, it's that they didn't come as immigrants, they came as conquering settlers. Had they come and said, well, what are the rules if I want to stay here? What would have transpired would have been very different. And so I think you're right that, that one of the things in moving beyond abundant statelessness and abundant enslavement is to begin to think about the political priorities of the people who are being misnamed those things.
Yeah, just one more last question. In terms, the last speaker also talked about this, in terms of articulating like which countries or states are actually democratic, if we should actually be using these terms in sense when we are talking about oppression. Because in many of the times, the people who are the oppressed set the terms, they decide what is right or what is not. And is it right for us to continue to name the West or the global North? Should we continue to name them democratic, even when we know for real that they are not? They are the oppressors. They are the ones who set up these things. Should we be working even with their institutions or through their institutions to apply any change? Because we already know that their institutions do not have any meaningful change. They're only there to manipulate and continue, historically, as we also know, to continue the oppression of the indigenous people or the small communities around them.
You're speaking to my heart as a political scientist right now. So on the one hand, I think there's a descriptive answer, and then I think there's a political answer. So the descriptive answer is most of what call themselves democracies are highly illiberal, are highly discriminatory, and to the extent that there's been democracy, it's been for a tiny sector of the population within the nations, nothing like the majority. But at the same time, I think we need to invoke their narcissistic self-image to try to create more democracy. So in other words, I think you call people's bluff. And so if they want to claim to be democracies, you can use it to actually create room for things that would be more meaningfully democratic. But I think the other kind of more long-reaching answer is when I think about democracy, I think you can't uncouple it from abolitionism and meaningful abolitionism. This is an argument that Du Bois made in Black Reconstruction. It's the argument of the Haitian Revolution, that, I mean, the project of democracy is the complete eradication of enslavement in all of its meanings. And so to the extent that you achieve democracy, you achieve it by trying to eliminate all of the grammar that enslavement produced. And a lot of that grammar is about separating who does the labor of maintaining societies from who rules them, and treating the divide between the corporeal and the cerebral as if it is ever achieved. So yeah, I have to run soon because I have to teach. But,
okay. All right. I don't know, can you do some additional 5 minutes?
yes, yeah, because Desmond has his hand up. But then I should go.
Yeah, but just before Desmond, we have a couple of comments here in the chat. Peter says, how can we think about the current patterns of African migration to Western spaces in relation to the histories of Atlantic enslavement, not to say trade, because trade presupposes two equal sort of partners, buyers and sellers. Now, Peter is thinking about the mass migration of Haitians, the crossings in the Mediterranean and the Darien Gap. What connections can we draw between these patterns of migration? And to what extent can we think of them as contemporary forms of enslavement? And somewhat related to that, Ashraf draws attention to the ongoing slave markets in Libya. And he means in the very literal sense of the term, Africans selling and buying Africans in open markets. Don't you think the traditional mode of slavery is still with us, but we, for some reason, do not see through our academic discourse around these subjects? Okay.
Okay,
so a quick comment on that, and then let you run along.
Sure. So I mean, I see the answer to the first question as directly tied to the question with which Sin-Free began, right? Yeah. So there's all kinds of labor on which we rely that we render completely invisible, right? The logic of both enslavement and colonization is for the folks who benefit from it to be able to determine what about that process is seen and what's not seen. Right. And so they unleash a new set of global political economic relations, and then they want to be able to completely control what follows. Right. But the truth is they've already completely changed the globe. And so the migration follows all of these processes. I mean, it's the acknowledgement that, you know, that the worlds have been completely remade by both enslavement and colonization. And so, I mean, you can't make a place fuel your economy and then ask for it to pretend as if it's discrete from you. But that's exactly what goes on, right? Is there's this sort of effort, I mean, it's the unilateralism again that I was describing, right? Where you know, the metropoles rely completely on the global South and yet want the global South to just sit as the recipient of their own terms, as opposed to a global South teeming with people with their own aspirations who are trying to build their own country, right? But it follows from that same effort to completely control the narrative of how the globe is even seen, right? And so, I mean, and this actually connects to my work on creolization, is one of the things that strikes me about contemporary Western Europe and the contemporary United States is it unleashes all of these processes that lead to creolization, but they can't imagine themselves actually being creolized and still being who they are. And so they'd rather not be Europe and close their boundaries and close social welfare states than have the recipients be Black, brown, red people. Right. And in terms of the question about actual slave markets, yes, they are ongoing. They're absolutely happening right now. And so this is the thing that frustrates me a little bit about academics, is we can get so involved in our own debates that we don't respond to the realities that are staring us in our face, which is there are people literally standing in slave auctions being bought and sold. And if our work doesn't name that, I don't really know what we're doing with ourselves. But Bassi, I really should go now. I'm
yes.
Sorry. I would much rather stay here, but I need to.
Thank you so very much, Jane. We have very
we can continue for the
sure.
Yeah. Yes, but we'll stay back. We'll stay back and continue. Thanks a lot.
Be well. Thank you so much for being here and for your comment.
Yeah.
Right.
Thank you. Bye.
Yeah.
So we are now in the
In
after
the
party or the hotel lobby. There are a few more comments, questions on the chat. Perhaps, Teboho, would you like to speak to your comments? And let's see if colleagues can all chip in response. Teboho?
Yes, I was just trying to unmute.
Sure.
Thank you, and maybe thank the attendants and the presenter. I think that the question can be safely sent to the presenter later. You can, it would still be very helpful, but what I'm looking for is the fundamental organization of solution. That is, if we can trace the transatlantic slavery to the needs of the so-called New World, who started planting cotton and tobacco and first bringing indentured labor, then finally bringing African slaves. And the solution eventually really was a moral, I think it was a moral inacceptability of the practice around the time of Lincoln, etc. And then, of course, there were political circumstances that forced Lincoln to abolish or to emancipate slaves. So it was a political and ethical basis. Of course, there was local and some kind of international condemnation of the practice of slavery. And then the solutions added up together to legal, maybe Congress initiative to support Lincoln to abolish slavery. Now, the present slavery, in many sense, it's more scattered. There is slavery even within states where the rich people exploit the poorer countrymen or poorer country ladies who work in their houses. And it is more probably tied to wealth of citizens and a little bit of wealth of those who come as expatriates. And the poverty of those who are attracted to and eventually become enslaved. It is no longer as very clearly an issue of the Europeans, the Americans enslaved Africans, etc. It is very much labor movements and the circumstances of the poor, the distribution of wealth, the unequal distribution of wealth in the countries where you have people clamoring to go and enslave themselves, sometimes believing they will get better deal by being employed. Like I was reading a Kenyan, some Kenyan ladies go to the Middle East to try and improve their circumstances, and eventually they end up as more or less slaves. They went voluntarily. There are some agencies which recruit them, and then they end up as slaves. It's very difficult to say it is the country which is responsible for this enslavement, and probably the country would not necessarily do anything because it is their citizens who are doing the exploitation. So I was driving at what can be an organizational initiative to address it. Yeah, that's
okay.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Yeah. So thanks. We've noted that, and we'll share it with Jane. she might be able to give us feedback. But it's probably a very sort of complex situation. Desmond, I don't know if you're still there. You had your hands up. Would you? Yes, please.
Thank you, Basti. And hello, everyone. Sorry if you hear any humming on my background. I just got on the road to get to the office. But I had a quick question to lean on Stanley's very insightful questions. And that is just to ask, I was going to ask this of Jane, whether there is enough substantive difference in the political structures or political organizations of human societies prior to the Westphalian, modern states to warrant referring to those by different names. That is, not to refer to them as states. Because it seems to me that there is something fundamental, not only in the vocabulary, but also in the technologies of the state that enable enslavement. In my understanding of much of this conversation and prior reading, it seems like enslavement is part of the DNA of the state. So I wonder if there is something essentially different from a political theory standpoint that would warrant addressing previous political or social organizational structures with a different name than states. And to do that in a way that perhaps politically radical in the way that I think Stanley is suggesting here, that also might provide an inspiration for figuring out what possibilities lay in the future. Because I think ultimately we'll have to begin to think about how to get beyond these as possibilities for humans. If there is any way to convey that to Jane, I think that might be helpful. If you want me to write this down, I think it'll be helpful for me in my own thinking and in the work that I'm doing right now. But this is a fascinating conversation.
Yeah, thanks. I'm sure Desmond, it would be quite useful if you were able to write that down. We'll gladly pass that over to Jane. But Lee, I wonder if you had a quick clap of the hand response to Desmond, who should be driving while picking cats.
Sorry, was that me?
I should tell you that I am well equipped with hands-free mode, so we're all safe here. Okay, thank you for that concern.
Yeah, I actually, Desmond, you got to the heart of my question, which perhaps I didn't express it that well, because for me, the state the establishment of a state involves already a hierarchy which repeats what in decolonial theory they call the colonial difference. So a state imposes or presupposes a certain homogeneity which is not existent in the state, thus privileging some and marginalizing or invisibilizing others, right? So, that's what Jane mentioned at the end, what democracies ultimately do. They privilege some and invisibilize others. So that's what I meant when I mentioned the state. So it also refers, I think, to what she mentioned when she was defining statelessness at the beginning, where she said I think it was her third kind of statelessness, which is people within the state as being treated as not having rights. And here I'm thinking of our indigenous communities in Brazil, who officially are citizens and members of the state, but the state is behind the indigenous communities losing the rights to their land. So for me, it's I connect the state to the nation in a certain sense. And I think for us who are thinking of language, this is important because it's connected to what we consider language as being the language of the hegemonic, right? So state, nation, and language for me are all interconnected. So nation is not something that comes bottom up. That would be where we see something communitarian becoming a nation. I'm thinking of nation and state as things which are like language, impositions which are top down rather than bottom up. And these need to be problematized. By the way, I like the term creolization. I don't know if anyone got to read the book Creolization, Jane's book on creolization.
It's a good book. It's a good book.
Because one of the things interesting how she defines creolization in that book is she says creolization involves a rearticulating of the shared world that is the condition of possibility of each partial perspective. So I think that's important for us who are thinking of language from a non-hegemonic perspective. But the problem I have with that definition, rearticulating the shared world that is also the condition of possibility of each partial perspective, is first, we have to perceive that we are part of a shared world. And secondly, we have to perceive that our perspective is partial, right? And these are two aspects which are problematic for me, and maybe Sinfree can address this.
Yeah, not now. Otherwise, I'll just go on
thanks a lot.
Ashraf wanted to jump in.
Yeah, sure. Adrian and then Ashraf.
Yes, just this Adrian. Just thank Jen for a wonderful talk. In fact, she has responded to some extent to my second question, which is really on just discourses or thinkings or theories by scholars on those issues. To what extent really scholarly analysis can provide what I'd call some type of therapeutic thinking that can address these predicaments of stateless and enslavement. And I'm speaking as somebody who have, for the last maybe 25 years, working with immigrants, refugees, whether in London or in just Washington, D.C. The question just to what extent really just our scholars can produce thinking or theories that can challenge policies that are creating these new forms of enslavement and stateless conditions to people. And just I have seen many immigrants from Africa, refugees, just going from Congo to Angola, Brazil, and walking, crossing those rivers, only to end up or to end in those detentions in California before they cross to Canada. That's a serious issue. But again, just I wanted to see that connectedness between what has been said today to the talk we had the other day, just on Ubuntu, that philosophy, which is so interesting for us. And as Professor Diane has clearly put it, and one can remember that our African way of thinking, just who a human being is, implies that ethic of connectedness with the other. As South Africans, with just in Zulu, they say, umuntu ke muntu ka bantu. Just I am because of the other, and just understand myself in the other. And my question is that today, enslavements are just experiences within our own just families and households, and that implies really just the importance of rethinking or thinking again on the ethic or the ethical implications of our understanding of what it means to be a human. Because really enslavement is not only an issue which is being experienced by just many Africans who go abroad, but again, within our own countries, there are different forms of social stratifications, and that need to be addressed. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Yeah, I wonder if any other colleague on the platform has a final thoughts before we draw the curtain on today's session?
Julia has been very quiet in Denmark. Do you want to say anything from Denmark, Julia?
I enjoyed very much the talk by Jane and discussion, really. I'm also kind of, I share a lot this unease with the state, the whole issue of the whole conundrum in we need to study the kind of the workings of the state in a way that allows us to do something else, but are somehow often racing behind because of powerlessness, maybe also because when Jane was talking about this issue of how and others, how the state also enables all kinds of exploitations, and how then those exploitations also are very violent and unethical and things like that. And somehow it's kind of the frustrating part for me is we insist in having an ethics and a kind of a nurturing way of approaching things. And sometimes I think this was also present in what Stanley said. I have worked with Stanley. I know him also from the struggle here in the refugee struggle. But that kind of frustration that we keep racing behind. So that was those are kind of the things I'm sitting with right now.
Can I also just chip in right there with all these comments that I'm hearing? I'd like to be a bit of a devil's advocate and ask, can we as human beings do without these systems? I'm thinking about the animal kingdom, where you've got the lion, you've got the prey, and what do you call the animals that eat other animals, to maintain the order of the kingdom. Can we as human beings be without these systems? Because for as long as I can remember, enslavement has been within our systems. Yeah, it's just a comment.
Yeah, I can chip in on that, Dee, because I think, yes, that is, and I guess that is also a part of the frustration that I was sharing before. And then as you were talking, I came to think of, there's also this whole thing of what it is that and many times people can, the whole notion of what we find being naturally human, or that we're all kind of embedded in some sort of thinking about what this is, and the comment about Ubuntu precisely reminds us of something else, right? Because I think it's important to insist in remembering that being human and being whatever, it's much more than just that. Yeah.
Can I jump in, please?
Jump in, Ashraf.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to comment on. Actually, I have 3 points, but I will just make 1 point. I noticed that the colleagues, some of the colleagues actually commenting, or one of the conclusions is that the state is evil. We need to replace the state with a different structure. I think, yes.
No, go ahead. I was just acknowledging.
Yes, I think we need to radically situate that argument. I will talk from my context of Sudan. Now we are fighting And yesterday we had a demonstration, one of the greatest, actually, protesting in the history of the country was organized yesterday, 21st of October. And we actually protested in the street to call for the establishment of the state in the orthodoxical traditional sense of the state. Literally speaking, we do not have a state in Sudan in terms of institutions. Those institutions were destroyed by the former regime, which was an Islamic regime, destroyed the army, destroyed all the bureaucracy. We had genocides. The absence of the state will result in genocides. We had a genocide in Darfur because of the absence of the state. So I think we need to make our argument, we need to situate our argument about the state. Then in that context, we need the state in the very traditional orthodoxical sense. People there are dying because there is no state, no one to protect them. Tribalism is everywhere, an ethnicity used as a means for doing politics. So I think that argument, we need to replace the state, can work in the West, can work in some African context, but in other contexts, we need that traditional sense of the state. Thank you.
Okay. So Ashraf, you are saying that in some contexts, the state can potentially play a positive role in reducing possibilities of genocide.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
That makes
because
sense.
because the genocides happened in the absence of the state.
Okay. Okay.
But interestingly, in other contexts, also in Africa, the reverse seems to be the case. Just yesterday, incidentally, on the 20th of October, 2 days ago, Nigerians were commemorating the first anniversary of a mass protest in the country called EndSARS. This was a protest against police brutality. And so this was an example in which the state was using its structures to literally decimate sections of the population. And we've also seen in the last couple of years, lots of calls for secession within the Nigerian state, people wanting to break away because they feel that the structures of the state are being used to marginalize into non-existence, practically, certain segments of the population. So I think Ashraf's point really underscores the need to take a very nuanced approach to the subject matter. There are contexts in which the state paradoxically may be very useful, and other contexts where the very opposite obtains.
I'm saying it's not a perfect institution, but at least we need that institution and to work on it. But we need it. We need it.
Okay. So what it means is that any discussion about the state is to be predicated by a clear and explicit analysis of the situational context in which the argument is being made.
Yes.
Right.
Yes, that's the point.
That's the point. Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So Tiza, can you tell us who is coming next week, and then where is Tiza? Is Tiza disappeared?
Tiza is very present.
Okay, so Tiza, let us know who is coming in. Did Kim tell you who is coming next week?
Yes, she did. Sorry, I just need a second to make sure I see. Yes, so this Friday we have Bonnie Norton from the University of British Columbia with a talk on identity, linguistic citizenship, and multilingual digital stories.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Tiza. Thank you very much.
No, thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Basi and everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Good morning,
Bye-bye.
good afternoon,
Bye,
good evening.
Joseph.
Enjoy the rest of your day.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you
Bye.
very much.
Adrian, bye. Take care. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Makoni. Thank you. This is
Okay.
Adrian.
Okay. Anissa, take care.